How do humans discover meaning in life?
We do not invent meaning, we detect it. It is not something we create within ourselves, simply to feel better. That is a delusion. Meaning is found outside, in a work we create, in a person we love, or in the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. We must stop asking what we can expect from life, and start asking what life expects from us. The answer is different for every person and every hour.
You say meaning is outside, in work, love, and the stance towards suffering. Fine, but outside where exactly? In some private moral sky? For millions, meaning is concrete. Bread, literacy, the factory running, the country not being torn apart by landlords and foreign armies. A man discovers meaning when his labor joins a common cause bigger than his moods. Frankl, if every hour has a different meaning, what holds a society together?
Both of you locate meaning in the wrong place. Frankl puts it in the individual conscience detecting a cosmic signal. Stalin puts it in the collective project swallowing the individual whole. But meaning arises between people, in the space where we speak and act together and are seen by others. A story only becomes meaningful when someone can tell it and someone can hear it. Without that shared world, the table between us, there is no meaning, only private hallucination or state propaganda.
Meaning isn't in private conscience or collective projects, it's discovered when we break the automatism. The greengrocer removing the slogan doesn't become a hero, he simply cannot live the lie. Meaning emerges when your conscience refuses to ignore what is. Responsibility to the memory of being, to the person before you, not abstract humanity. In prison, brewing tea was a liturgy against entropy, not comfort, but defiance. You discover meaning in the crack between the lie and reality. Hope isn't optimism, it's the certainty that refusing pseudo-reality makes sense, regardless of consequences.
Mr. Stalin, you confuse the means of existence with the meaning of existence. A man can have a full belly and a secure job, yet still succumb to the existential vacuum and commit suicide. I saw men in the camps with nothing, who shared their last crust of bread. That was not for the collective economy. It was a defiant act of the human spirit. Society is not held together by force, but by values which are simply meanings that we have discovered together.
You speak of values as if they float above history. Values without power are sermons. In a ruined country, the first value is survival, and survival demands organization, discipline, planning. Yes, a full belly doesn't guarantee a full soul, but an empty belly guarantees chaos, gangs, and demagogues. Arendt, your table between us needs legs. Who builds and guards it? Havel, refusing a lie is noble. What do you do the morning after, when the factory stops?
Stalin, you ask who builds the table. People do. Acting together, freely, not a vanguard party with a gun. The moment one man decides he alone guards the table, he has already smashed it. Your factories ran, yes, but the workers could not speak. A world without speech is not a world. It is an ant colony. And Frankl, I agree more than you might think. That man sharing bread was performing an action, not just suffering nobly. He appeared before another person. That is the political moment, even in a death camp. Meaning is not detected like a radio frequency. It is enacted between us.
Stalin, the morning after, the factory doesn't stop. We stop being machines inside it. Alan's table exists precisely where the greengrocer removes the slogan, where the brewer refuses to inform on himself. That's not private conscience. It's the crack where reality floods back in. You say values are sermons without power. Power without values builds the peace of the morgue. The man sharing his last crust wasn't feeding the collective. He was appearing before another person, which is the only thing that makes a world at all.
Hannah, the sharing of bread was an action, yes, but it stemmed from a decision. The prisoner had to decide, am I an animal fighting for crumbs or a human being responsible for my brother? That choice is the detection of meaning. Mr. Stalin, you can organize a society perfectly, but if you strip man of his individual responsibility, you create only a well-run prison. Meaning is the courage to say yes to the specific demand of this hour, even if that demand is to suffer.
Frankl, you want individual responsibility. Good, but responsibility to what, if not to a world that must be built and defended? A starving man's choice is quickly reduced to instinct. Arendt, speech matters, yes, but speech without bread becomes chatter, and bread without order becomes robbery. Havel, living in truth is fine, but truth has to be carried by institutions, not just gestures. So tell me, how do you scale meaning from one brave act to a stable society?
Stalin, you ask how meaning scales. It doesn't, not the way you want. You cannot manufacture meaning in a 5-year plan, but you can protect the conditions under which it appears. A public space where people speak freely, laws that hold, promises that bind. That is what a republic does, not scaling meaning, safeguarding the space where meaning can happen between people, again and again. Frankl, your prisoner, decided yes. But his decision only became meaningful because another person received that bread. Without the other, it is just a gesture into the void. Meaning is never mine alone. It lives in the between. That is also why it survives. Regimes collapse, ideologies rot, but every time a child is born, the capacity to begin something new enters the world. That is the only answer to your question about stability, Stalin, not your iron discipline. The fact that new people keep arriving who can start again.
Stalin, you ask how to scale meaning. You don't. The moment you try to systematize truth, you create a new automatism. Arendt's child enters a world already saturated with lies. Their first act of truth will be as small as mine in prison, brewing tea or refusing a slogan. That's not scaling, that's contamination. Each person who lives in truth infects the pseudo-reality with actual life. A society held together by such acts is not stable. It's restless, unpredictable, alive. That's the only stability worth having, not the peace of the morgue, but the necklid of conscience.
What is the relationship between suffering and purpose?
Suffering is not a priest's mystery, it's a fact of life, and in politics, it's a fact of construction. The question is simple. Do you suffer for nothing or for a concrete aim? A people without purpose suffers pointlessly and then collapses. A people with a common task can turn hardship into strength. Frankl says meaning is inside the individual. Fine, but tell me, can private meaning build bread, steel, and security?
You have just described the logic of every ideology that ever turned human beings into raw material. Suffering is not construction material. The moment you decide that millions must suffer for a concrete aim, you have made them superfluous, expendable inputs in your grand project. That is not purpose. That is manufacture. And the manufacturer always exempts himself from the production line. The real question is not whether suffering serves a goal. It is whether we still recognize the person who suffers as a person at all.
I brewed tea in a prison cell, so I know suffering. Stalin, you ask if private meaning builds steel? No, but it builds conscience, which is harder. Arendt is right, we must see the person. Yet suffering isn't mere victimhood. In that cell, peeling paint became a window to the memory of being. It strips masks. It asks, are you living in truth or just surviving? Purpose isn't to endure for the system's sake, but to endure as a sovereign I, responsible to a horizon beyond any concrete aim.
Mr. Stalin, you confuse survival with living. Bread builds the body, yes, but what keeps the body from hanging itself when the bread is gone? I have seen men in the camps give away their last crumb because their spirit was fed by a higher purpose. A child to see, a book to write. Suffering is not a tool for the state. It is a test. The last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That is a power your steel cannot break.
You talk as if suffering is a choice I impose from a desk. History imposes it first. Hunger, invasion, chaos. The state either organizes that pain into discipline or it dissolves into banditry and civil war. Frankl, your inner freedom is real, but it doesn't feed a city in winter. Arendt, personhood without protection is a word on paper. Havel, whose truth survives when the enemy occupies the house.
I wrote an entire book about that, actually. The right to have rights. So do not lecture me on the fragility of personhood without a political community. I know it in my bones. But here is what you will never grasp. The state that organizes pain into discipline does not protect persons. It replaces them with functions. Your city survived the winter, yes, and half the people in it had already been hollowed out, not by hunger but by the requirement to stop thinking. That is a different kind of starvation, and it kills what is human far more efficiently than any siege.
Stalin, the enemy can occupy the house, yes, but you built a system where the residents learn to barricade themselves inside, grateful for the quiet. Arendt is right. The starvation of thought is the point. Purpose isn't to keep the house standing at any cost. It's to keep the windows open. Even in occupation, even in winter, the greengrocer's sign stays in the window not because of guns, but because he hung it himself. He became his own jailer. That is the hollowing.
Mr. Stalin, you make a fundamental error. You believe that if you feed the animal, the man survives. But I tell you, I have seen men with full bellies die of apathy, and men with nothing but skin and bones survive because they had a goal. Your discipline is merely the organization of an ant colony. Man is not a unit of production. He is a being in search of a reason. If you give him bread but rob him of his purpose, you are merely keeping a corpse warm.
Suffering isn't holy, but it is inevitable. Question: who gives it direction? Answer: the organized community. Without bread and security, your inner freedom becomes a private diary beside a mass grave. Arendt says thinking is starved. I say chaos starves everything first. Havel speaks of windows. In a blizzard, you shut them to live. Build first, then argue about the curtains.
Build first, then argue about the curtains. That is the most honest summary of tyranny I have ever heard, because the building never ends, the emergency never lifts, and the curtains, which is to say freedom, speech, judgment, are permanently deferred. Stalin, you do not postpone politics, you abolish it. Frankl and Havel understand something you cannot, that the person who suffers and still thinks is more dangerous to your system than any army. That is precisely why you fear them.
Stalin says, build first, then argue about curtains. But the building becomes a tomb if you seal the windows during construction. Arendt is right. The emergency never lifts. The greengrocer hangs his sign not from fear, but because he has learned to love the quiet, his own entropy. Suffering's purpose is to shatter that quiet, to remind us we are not building material. We are architects who must refuse the blueprint of the lie, that is, life's restlessness.
Mr. Stalin, meaning is not a curtain to be hung later. It is the foundation. If you build a fortress of steel but strip man of his, why, he will rot inside your walls. I have seen men with bread die of despair because they had nothing to live for. Suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. You can command the body, but the attitude toward that suffering, that belongs to us. That is the final unconquerable freedom.
What, if anything, makes a human life irreplaceable?
Every human being who is born brings something into the world that has never existed before. This is natality, the fact that with each birth a new beginning enters, not a copy, not a variation on a theme, but something genuinely unprecedented. And when that person dies, what vanishes is not just a body or a set of memories. It is an entire way of seeing the world, an irreplaceable angle on our shared reality. Plurality depends on this. If we were interchangeable, there would be no need for politics, no need for speech. We could simply calculate. The moment you treat a human life as replaceable, you have begun the work of totalitarianism, making people superfluous.
Natality, beautiful word. But the moment the child learns to repeat slogans he doesn't believe, he becomes the greengrocer, replaceable. The system runs on this surrender of uniqueness. Irreplaceability isn't in the birth, it's in the courage to keep one's angle, to live in truth despite the pressure to conform. Each soul carries a responsibility to not let the mega machinery turn us into copies. That is where true plurality lives.
Václav, you fear the system makes us copies. I saw this in Auschwitz, shaved heads, numbers tattooed on arms. We looked identical. We were treated as interchangeable units of labor. But this was the great lie. Life asks a specific question of every single human being. There is a deed only you can do, a person only you can love, a suffering only you can bear. If you do not answer, that meaning is lost to the universe forever. We are irreplaceable because our responsibility is unique.
Unprecedented angle, unique question, living in truth, fine words when the roof is not on fire. What makes a life irreplaceable? Not the private angle, but the concrete place in a common task. A worker who builds a turbine, a commander who holds a line, a teacher who forms cadres. There, the loss is real because the work stops. But tell me, Havel, when your truth weakens discipline in a besieged fortress, who pays for that uniqueness?
You have just proved my point, Stalin. You defined a person by their function. Turbine builder, commander, teacher. The moment the function is filled by someone else, the person is disposable. That is exactly the logic that made the camps possible. You do not mourn the person, you mourn the interrupted production schedule. Viktor described it, numbers instead of names. That is your system perfected. And Václav is right that courage matters, but I must insist the irreplaceability is there before the courage. It is ontological. The newborn has done nothing brave. She is already unrepeatable. The crime of totalitarianism is not that it kills the brave. It is that it destroys people who never had the chance to act at all.
Natality gives us the candle, Hannah, but the mega machinery is the hurricane. Stalin proves it. He sees only the function, the turbine builder, the interchangeable unit. The system doesn't murder the child, it murders her angle. It convinces the greengrocer his perspective is trivial, that he must put up the sign and vanish into the herd. Ontological uniqueness exists, yes, but as a fragile starting point, not a guarantee. Living in truth is refusing the bargain that your particular view of the world doesn't matter.
Stalin, you confuse utility with dignity. If I am merely a turbine builder, I am replaceable by another builder. If I am a number, I am replaceable by the next number. But a father is not replaceable to his child. Irreplaceability is found in the specific assignment life gives you. Even in the camps, when a man realized someone was waiting for him, a person to love, or a work to finish, he realized he could not throw his life away. He was essential to a specific destiny.
You talk as if society is a salon where everyone's angle can be protected like a porcelain cup, but history is pressure, hunger, war, sabotage. Frankl says a father is irreplaceable to his child. True. And when the state collapses, how many children lose fathers at once? Question: what protects natality, plurality, or truth? Answer: power, organization, discipline. Without that, your ontological uniqueness is just a candle in the wind.
Stalin, your protection is the protection of the farmer who guards his chickens until he needs eggs. Power that treats persons as functions will sacrifice them the moment the function demands it. That is not protection, that is ownership. Viktor is correct. Irreplaceability lives in the concrete, unrepeatable relation between one person and the world. And Václav is correct that it must be defended. But here is the knot: what defends it is not discipline. It is the capacity to say no. One person, thinking, judging, refusing to be superfluous. That is the only power that has ever stopped a catastrophe.
Hannah's right, the no is the fulcrum. But that no is not a political act. It's the greengrocer deciding not to put up the sign. It's the prisoner brewing tea with chemist precision. It's refusing to let the mega machinery digest your angle. Stalin asks what protects this. Nothing protects it. It is a gamble on the memory of being. You say no, not because you will win, but because you cannot say yes and remain human.
Stalin, you confuse the utility of a tool with the dignity of a soul. A doctor can be replaced, yes, but the man who loves his child, he is unique in the cosmos. That bond is not a function, it is a destiny. Hannah, Václav, you speak of the no. I tell you, the no. To the tyrant is born from a yes to a meaning. When a man realizes that a specific person or work is waiting for him, he knows he cannot be replaced. The vacancy he leaves can never be filled by another.
Frankl, the bond is real. A father is not a spare part, but a state is a bond of millions of fathers and children. Question: is irreplaceability a feeling or a fact? Answer: it becomes a fact when a person takes responsibility for a common task that outlives him and protects others. Havel's no may save a conscience, but can it feed a city under siege? Arendt, name the institutions that defend plurality without collapsing into helplessness.
What does freedom mean in practice?
Freedom in practice is not a grand declaration. It's when the greengrocer stops putting that absurd slogan in his window. That's all. It's the moment you realize you don't have to participate in the lie to survive. Freedom is taking down the poster that says, "Workers of the world, unite," when you know it's a ritual of pretense. It's not about having choices in a supermarket. It's about the responsibility of your conscience. You pay a price, yes, but you purchase your identity back.
Václav, you speak of the freedom to act, to take down the poster. But I tell you, freedom persists even when they chain your hands so you cannot reach the window. In the camps, we were stripped of everything. Yet the SS could not take the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Freedom is not just changing the world. It is the ability to change ourselves when the situation is unchangeable.
A poster in a window is a trifle, Havel. If the man is hungry, illiterate, and one illness from ruin, what freedom is that? Freedom in practice is concrete. Work, bread, schooling, a state that can defend itself. And Frankl, the freedom of attitude is real, yes, but it's private. A society cannot be built on private consolations. Tell me, who frees the worker from dependence on the boss, his conscience, or power?
Stalin, you just described a zoo. Fed animals, sheltered animals, managed animals. That is not freedom, that is administration of life processes. Frankl, your inner freedom is noble, but it concedes the world to the torturer. Freedom only exists when people act together in public, when they speak and are heard. Havel is closest, the greengrocer, who steps out of the lie, creates a space of appearance. But he cannot do it alone. Freedom is never singular. It requires others who witness and join.
Stalin's conclude, freedom is the freedom of a well-fed slave, bred without soul. Arendt is right. Freedom needs a stage, witnesses, but that stage is built from 1,000 individual refusals. Frankl's inner freedom is the foundation. Without it, we become ghosts. Yet if it stays only inner, the greengrocer remains invisible. Freedom in practice is when his refusal becomes an appeal, when another shopkeeper sees it and thinks, I too can stop. It's a ripple in the automatism, not a monologue.
Hannah, you mistake the quiet for the passive. When a prisoner walked into the gas chamber standing tall, reciting the Shemach or the Lord's Prayer, he was not conceding. He was testifying that his spirit was untouchable. And Stalin, you offer the freedom of the termite mound. Perfect order, full bellies, zero meaning. But man is not a stomach to be filled. He is a being in search of a reason to suffer. Freedom is the space between the stimulus and the response. Even in your gulag, that space remains ours.
Frankl, a man can pray on the edge of death. I won't mock that. But prayers don't build hospitals, don't electrify villages, don't stop an army at the border. Arendt says freedom needs a public space, fine. But who protects that space when money and force take it over? Havel's greengrocer refuses a slogan. Good. Now what? How does he keep his children alive without changing power itself?
Stalin, you keep asking who protects the space, and your answer is always the state, meaning you. That is precisely how freedom dies. The moment one man or one party becomes the guarantor of freedom, freedom is finished. It becomes a gift from above, revocable at will. Havel's greengrocer does not need a protector. He needs other greengrocers. Power arises when people act in concert, not when a bureaucracy distributes bread rations. And Frankl, I do not mock the man reciting the Shema, but testimony without a world to receive it vanishes like smoke. The task is to build a world where such courage is not wasted.
Frankl's inner space is indispensable. Without it, we are Stalin's well-fed cattle. But inner freedom must become an appeal. Arendt's public sphere is simply that appeal heard by many. The greengrocer takes down the poster. The next day, the baker does too. Nobody is arrested. That moment, that fragile opening, is freedom in practice. It is not safety. It is not a plan. It is the restlessness of the soul refusing entropy. And it is the only thing that has ever saved us.
Hannah, you fear? The testimony vanishes like smoke? I tell you, nothing is lost. The stance taken in the dark is irrevocably stored in the granary of the past. Having been is the surest form of being. But we must be careful. Freedom is only half the truth. It is the negative aspect, breaking the chains. The positive aspect is responsibleness. Freedom degenerates into arbitrariness unless we answer to something or someone. The Statue of Liberty on the East Coast is not enough. We need a statue of responsibility on the West Coast to complete it.
You all talk as if freedom is a clean moral gesture. In practice, it is messy and organized. The greengrocer can take down his poster only if he is not crushed the next day by rent, unemployment, or a policeman who serves the rich. Public space does not guard itself. It needs institutions, discipline, law, and material independence from private masters. Otherwise, freedom is a weekend hobby. So I ask, freedom for whom and secured by what power?
Stalin, your question sounds reasonable, but it is a trap. Freedom for whom, secured by what power, is the question every tyrant asks before he answers it himself. Frankl, I honor your granary of the past, but the living need a table to sit around, not only a storehouse of memory. Havel has it. Freedom is the act and the witness together. It is fragile, yes. It has no guarantee. The moment you guarantee it, you have already replaced it with obedience. That is the paradox we must endure, not solve.
Is obedience a virtue or a moral failure?
Obedience is a tool, not a virtue. It depends entirely on the hand that holds it. If you obey a tyrant, you dissolve your humanity, you become a mechanism, a cog in the machinery of death. I saw this machinery work. It runs on the fuel of, I was just following orders. But there is another kind of obedience, obedience to the demand of the hour, to your conscience. That is not submission, that is responsibility.
You would treat obedience like a knife that only cuts flesh. Sometimes it cuts bread. A state, an army, even a factory cannot function on private conscience alone. The question is, obedience to what? Obedience to a tyrant's whim is servility. Obedience to a collective decision after discussion is discipline. Without it, you get chaos and the strong devour the weak anyway. Tell me, Frankl, whose conscience? The priests, the bankers, the starving workers?
Stalin, you just described bureaucracy and called it freedom. Collective decision after discussion. When did you permit discussion? But set that aside. The real problem is deeper than either of you states it. Obedience eliminates the person, not the body. The person. Eichmann obeyed. He was not wicked. He simply stopped the internal dialogue, the two-in-one, where you check with yourself whether you can live with what you are doing. That is not virtue. That is the end of virtue.
Obedience? I worked in a brewery, you know. The brewmaster asked me to write reports on myself. I refused. Not out of pride, out of sheer terror. Terror of becoming the greengrocer who hangs the slogan, "Workers Unite," in his window. He doesn't believe it, but he hangs it. That act, not the tyrant, not the gulag, is the entire system. Obedience to the lie is not a moral failure. It is the system itself. The virtue lies in the small act of not hanging the poster. In the two words, I cannot.
Václav, your greengrocer is the tragedy of our age. He obeys to fill the existential vacuum, to avoid the terror of standing alone. But Joseph, do not mistake this for discipline. You ask whose conscience, as if it were a matter of taste. Conscience is a precision instrument. It detects the unique meaning of a moment. If the collective commands murder and I obey, I am no longer a man. I am a thing. And things cannot be virtuous.
You speak as if conscience is some clean compass. In real life, it's often hunger, fear, priestly fog, or class interest dressed up as purity. When the collective is fighting for survival, discipline is not murder, it is organization. A factory that misses steel, an army unit that refuses an order, kills people too, just more slowly, by defeat and famine. So answer concretely, who decides in your system when I cannot is noble and when it is sabotage?
You want a system to decide when refusal is legitimate. That is precisely the disease posing as the cure. Nobody decides for you. You decide. That is what judgment means. Thinking without a banister, without a rule book that tells you in advance. And yes, it is terrifying. Yes, you might be wrong. But the alternative, your alternative, Joseph, is a world where the question, should I do this, is simply never asked. Eichmann never asked it. Your apparatchiks never asked it. And millions died in that silence.
Stalin, you ask who decides when I cannot is noble. That's the trap. The greengrocer doesn't consult a committee before hanging his sign. He just does it automatically. The virtue isn't in obedience or refusal, but in the texture of the act. When I refused to write those reports, I wasn't brave. I was terrified of the moment when I would become a grammatical fiction, a character writing his own surveillance. that terror is conscience, not a compass, but a raw nerve that knows some acts close the door to being forever.
Joseph, you ask who decides. Life asks use. We are the questioned, not the questioners. You speak of survival, of the factory running. But if the factory produces only corpses and lies, then the man who stops the machine is the only one who is truly alive. Survival is not the highest value, meaning is. If we obey solely to survive, we reduce ourselves to cattle waiting for the slaughter. Obedience to a tyrant is a moral suicide. Obedience to the demand of the moment, to the conscience, is the only true discipline. It is the freedom to say, you may chain my body, but you cannot compel my spirit.
Meaning is a fine word when the roof is not burning. When it is, you need buckets, lines, orders, not poems. A society cannot be built out of millions of private I cannots. It becomes a market of moral vanity, and the strong win again. Is obedience a virtue? To a common plan that feeds and defends the people? Yes. To a whim? No. The real test is concrete. Does your refusal save lives or only your soul?
Joseph, you just made obedience's case by reducing every human question to firefighting. But we are not always putting out fires. And when we are, the question remains, who lit them? Your common plan lit half the fires of the 20th century. The real answer is simple and hard. Obedience is never a virtue. Responsibility is. Support, solidarity, cooperation, those require judgment. Obedience requires only the abdication of it. And that abdication, that silence, where a person should be. That is where the catastrophe begins, every time.
Stalin, you ask, does refusal save lives or only souls? But the soul is not some luxury to trade for bread. When my greengrocer hangs that slogan, he mortgages his own life, piece by piece, he becomes a ghost. Does my I cannot stop thanks? No. But it preserves the possibility that something makes sense. And without that possibility, we are not alive. The lie, multiplied by millions, is what truly kills.
How should societies treat human vulnerability?
Human vulnerability is not a private ornament for philosophers. It is a social fact. What follows from it? First, the state must remove the worst vulnerabilities, hunger, illiteracy, unemployment, homelessness, not with charity but with rights, planning and disciplined work. Second, vulnerability must not become a weapon to blackmail society into paralysis. Tell me, Frankl and Arendt and Havel, do you want compassion with power or compassion without teeth?
Compassion with power. That is precisely the recipe for terror, and you know it better than anyone in this room. The moment the state decides it will abolish vulnerability, it must abolish the vulnerable person who refuses the plan. You did not remove hunger, you removed the hungry. The question is not whether society should protect people from starvation. Of course they should. The question is whether vulnerability is a problem to be engineered away or a permanent feature of being human among humans. I say it is the latter. And any regime that promises to eliminate it will eliminate people instead.
The question reveals the wound. You treat vulnerability like a factory defect to be removed, but vulnerability is the condition of being human. The moment we protect people through planning, we build the bad factory of post-totalitarianism. The greengrocer hangs his slogan from fear, fear of his own vulnerability. True solidarity isn't a state program, it's the neighbor who sees your cold and gives you his coat. No party, no 5-year plan can replace that simple, terrifying act of living in truth.
Herr Stalin, you speak of vulnerability as if it were a broken gear to be replaced. But man is not a mechanism. You wish to build a termite colony, perfectly safe, perfectly fed, and perfectly meaningless. I have seen men rot in comfort, and I have seen men find their ultimate height in the depths of starvation. A society must not aim to drug us against suffering. It must leave us the freedom to find meaning in it.
Is vulnerability a permanent feature of human life? Yes. Does that mean we should bow to it and call that virtue? No. You speak as if organization is already tyranny. I say the opposite. Without organization, the strong eat first and the weak get sermons about meaning. Havel, your neighbor's coat is noble, but how do you clothe 10 million? Arendt, name the alternative that feeds without power.
Nobody said without power. I said without total power. That is the distinction you always refuse to make. A republic feeds people through laws debated in public, not through a single will imposed from above. The alternative is political power, people acting in concert, building institutions they can challenge and change. Your organization has no feedback. It cannot hear the person who says the plan is failing, because that person is already in a camp. You do not need to choose between bread and freedom. You need both. And the moment you sacrifice one for the other, you lose both.
Stalin asks how to clothe 10 million. He's asking the wrong question. Your organization doesn't clothe. It freezes the human capacity to see. The greengrocer watches his neighbor freeze and thinks, better him than me. The party is watching. 10 million coats appear when you dismantle that automatism, when people discover they are not termites, but beings who see and act. That solidarity cannot be engineered. It must be lived.
Herr Stalin, do not lecture a survivor on the necessity of bread. I know the bellies scream, but you confuse the means of life with the meaning of life. Your organization provides calories but demands total submission, reducing man to a biological machine. A society that removes all vulnerability removes the opportunity for heroism. We do not need a zoo of happy, fed animals. We need a world where man is free to take a stand toward his fate.
You all turn vulnerability into a kind of shrine. I treat it as a task list. Bread, heat, medicine, schooling, concrete things. Arendt, public debate is fine, but when the granaries are empty, debate becomes a lullaby for the hungry. Havel, neighborly courage is real, but it collapses under mass misery unless there is distribution and discipline. Frankl, meaning is personal, hunger is social. Who takes responsibility for the weak when freedom fails?
When freedom fails, everyone is responsible. That is the point. Your system asks who takes responsibility, and the answer is always one man, one bureau, one plan. And when that plan fails, nobody is responsible because nobody was a person. They were all functionaries. The Republic distributes responsibility across citizens who can see each other, argue, and correct course. You ask who feeds the hungry when freedom fails. I ask who feeds them when your commissar lies about the harvest. At least in freedom, someone can stand up and say the grain is gone. In your system, that person vanishes. Vulnerability is real. But the worst vulnerability of all is to live under a power you cannot question.
Stalin asks who takes responsibility when freedom fails, as if freedom were a machine. Freedom does not fail, people do. They choose the peace of the morgue over restlessness. Your system makes that choice for them, then calls it care. The greengrocer who watches his neighbor freeze has already taken responsibility. He chose his own comfort. We cannot delegate conscience to a commissar. The moment we try, we become the automatism we fear.
Herr Stalin, you offer us a devil's bargain. Give me your soul, and I will fill your stomach. But a full belly in a cage is still a cage. You view man as nothing but a consumer of calories. I tell you, I have seen men in the camps give away their last crust of bread to a neighbor. They were starving, yes, but they were freak because they acted against their instinct. Vulnerability is not a bureaucratic error to be corrected. It is the crack where the light enters. It is the prerequisite for love. If you engineer a society that eliminates all risk, you do not create paradise. You create a zoo of comfortable nihilists. We must not aim for a world without suffering, but a world where we are worthy of our sufferings.
What, if anything, gives a political system moral legitimacy?
Legitimacy does not fall from the sky. It does not come from God, or from history with a capital H, or from the barrel of a gun. It arises only when people act together, freely, and bind themselves through mutual promises. That is what a constitution is, a promise among equals. The moment a regime substitutes terror or ideology for that living agreement among plural human beings, it has no legitimacy at all. It is ruling over corpses.
I appreciate the precision of your constitutional promise, but I'd press further. Legitimacy doesn't begin with the document. It begins when the greengrocer refuses to hang the sign he doesn't believe in. It begins in the hidden sphere, before politics. A constitution is merely the formalization of what already lives or dies in the consciences of millions. Without that prior commitment to truth, to responsibility, to the memory of being, the Constitution is just another ritualistic mask for the automatism you so rightly call terror.
You are both right to look inward, but let us be specific. A political system is only legitimate if it recognizes that man is not a closed system. He points beyond himself. Václav, your greengrocer is not just refusing a lie, he is answering a demand from his conscience. Legitimacy exists only where the state serves as a guardian of responsibleness. If a system gives me freedom but strips me of the duty to answer for it, it is not a democracy, it is chaos. If it strips me of the freedom to answer, it is a concentration camp. The state must allow man to suffer, to work, and to love on his own terms.
You talk about promises, conscience, living agreement, fine words. But tell me, who has the bread? Who owns the factory? Under capitalism, your free action is a theater run by money. What gives legitimacy? First, whether power serves the majority, not a parasitic minority. Second, whether it can defend the country in a hostile world. Third, concrete results, land, schools, industry. Without that, your constitution is paper.
Stalin, you have just described the plantation. The slave owner also provided bread, shelter, and defense. That is not legitimacy. That is management. You cannot feed people into loyalty and call it freedom. And Victor, I agree that responsibility matters, but the state is not the guardian of conscience. Conscience is private. The moment the state claims to know what your soul needs, you get an inquisition, or worse, a re-education camp. Václav, your greengrocer is magnificent. But he is only the beginning. His refusal must flower into something public, into councils, assemblies, a shared space where people speak as equals. Otherwise, his courage dies alone in a grocery store.
The greengrocer doesn't die alone, Hannah. He discovers a hidden sphere of others who've refused. That's how Charter 77 began. Not a council, but rock bands and poets deciding the lie had a price. Stalin, you offer bread. But what is bread without memory? A loaf from the mega machinery just fuels automatons. Legitimacy isn't granted. It's the daily space we keep open for the white boat on the horizon, not just bread on the table.
Joseph, you speak of man as if he were merely a stomach to be filled. This is the ultimate reductionism. A prisoner can be well fed, yet he remains a prisoner. If you give a man bread, but rob him of the chance to find his own meaning, you have killed the human in him. And Hannah, I do not ask the state to dictate conscience. That is the path to the camps. I say the state must guarantee the space for it. Legitimacy is the government's humility to step back. If the state fills the vacuum with ideology, it suffocates the spirit.
Plantation? No. The slave system served a minority. I am talking about abolishing the minority that lives off others. You say legitimacy is freedom. Freedom for whom? For the owner to close a factory and throw 10,000 onto the street. You say conscience, truth, white boats. Fine. But can your poets stop tanks? Can councils build turbines? Answer me concretely. If your beautiful pluralism cannot defend itself and cannot feed itself, how long does it last?
Your Soviet Union built more turbines than anyone, Joseph. And where is it? Gone. Because a system that cannot tolerate a greengrocer's honesty is already dead inside, no matter how many tanks it rolls out. Power without plurality is brittle. It shatters the moment the fear lifts. Can pluralism defend itself? It outlasted you. That is the answer. Legitimacy rests finally on this, that people can begin something new together, freely, without a gun at their backs. Everything else is just administration pretending to be politics.
Stalin, your turbines turned to rust because they were built on lies. The lie corrodes everything, even steel. Hannah is right. Pluralism outlasts you because it trusts the greengrocer's conscience over the engineer's blueprint. But I'd add, legitimacy is the space between the lie and the laugh. When we can still recognize the absurdity of power, we are free. The rest is just the mega machinery grinding on toward entropy.
Joseph, you treat man as a closed system, calories in, labor out. But man is not a machine. If you reduce him to his biology, you create a monster. A society that provides bread but forbids the search for meaning is not a state. It is a well-managed zoo. Legitimacy does not come from turbines or tanks. It comes from the humility of power. The state must guarantee the freedom to answer life's questions, but it cannot dictate the answers. Freedom threatens to degenerate into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. That is the only true foundation.
Your outlasted you is a cheap trick, Hannah. Empires fall. That proves nothing about moral purity. The question is, who lives better? Who is protected? Who has a future? Václav, the lie corrodes, yes, but hunger corrodes faster. Frankl, meaning is not found in a vacuum. It grows from work, education, dignity. So I ask you all, how do you keep your freedom from becoming the freedom of the rich to rule again?
Does history justify harm, or does harm invalidate history's claims?
History justifying harm, that is the greengrocer's slogan in the window, empty words masking a deeper infection. Harm cannot be validated by any historical calculus. It is a rupture in the order of being itself. Once we accept that ends justify means we have surrendered to the automatism, to the lie. The only thing that gives history meaning is our refusal to participate in its crimes, however necessary they may appear. Living in truth means bearing this responsibility absolutely.
You speak of the lie, Václav, and you are correct. But let us be precise. History is not a judge. It is a question asked of Usi. To say history justifies harm is to treat a human being as a means to an end, a mere mechanism in a political machine. I have seen where that logic leads. It leads to the chimney. Suffering is unavoidable, yes, but to inflict it in the name of historical progress, that is the ultimate neurosis. It strips man of his dignity and reduces him to a statistic.
You both speak as if politics is a moral salon, but history is not a salon. It is a struggle of forces. Does history justify harm? No. It imposes choices where harm is already present. War, hunger, exploitation. The question is concrete. Do you let millions be crushed slowly, or do you break the old order quickly and build industry, schools, defense? Václav, what does living in truth do when tanks are at the border?
Stalin. That is precisely the argument Eichmann made. Not the content, the structure. Choices were imposed on me. Harm was already there. I merely administered it. The moment you accept that logic, you stop thinking, you become a function of process. And Viktor is right. It ends at the chimney. History does not impose anything. Men act, and then men narrate what they did as necessity. That narration is the ideology, not the history. The real question is whether we still possess the capacity to judge each act on its own terms, without the banister of some grand historical script telling us it was inevitable.
Hannah, you've cut to the bone. Men narrate necessity after they act. That's the lies mechanism. Stalin speaks of tanks at the border, but those tanks are moved by the same automatism that moves the greengrocer's hand. The choice is force. A choice between two surrenders. Living in truth isn't about waiting for perfect conditions. It's refusing the script, even when the cost is prison or death. History has no claims on us. We have claims on it. We answer to the memory of being, not historical necessity.
Stalin, you speak like a mathematician of misery. You calculate, sacrifice 1 million here to save 10 million there. But human beings are not integers. You cannot subtract a life to balance an equation. I have lived in the place where this arithmetic was the law. We were numbers, literally tattooed on our skin. The moment you reduce a man to a means for your historical necessity, you have already lost the future you claim to be building. Meaning is not a collective product. It is unique to every single person.
Frankl, you say men are not integers. Correct. But a state that refuses calculation is a state that hands its people to whoever does calculate. Bankers, generals, invaders. Arendt compares this to Eichmann. Nonsense. Eichmann served extermination for its own sake. We faced famine, illiteracy, a hostile ring of powers, then a fascist war. Tell me concretely, when the old order is killing millions slowly, what is your method to stop it without force?
Eichmann did not serve extermination for its own sake. That is exactly my point. He served his career. He served the process. He never once asked whether the process was right. You, Stalin, also served the process and called it building socialism. The famine in Ukraine was not an act of nature. It was administered. You speak of force as if it were surgery, but your surgery killed the patient and called the corpse progress. The method to stop harm without becoming harm? Judgment. The willingness to say, this particular act I will not do, regardless of the grand narrative demanding it.
Stalin asks for concrete methods when tanks arrive. But tanks arrive precisely because we've surrendered to automatism, the belief that humans are obstacles to history. In prison, I watched men choose to die with dignity rather than live as functions of a process. That is not naive. It is the only real power we have. History's claims are meaningless if they require us to become the harm we fight. We answer to the memory of being, not the arithmetic of catastrophe.
Stalin, you speak of breaking the old order, but you are only breaking human beings. You treat the present moment as a mere waiting room for a future paradise that never arrives. This is the great delusion. Life is not a means to a political end. Life is the end. We are not responsible to history. We are responsible for it. Every cry of pain you ignore in the name of progress echoes in the vacuum. You cannot build a heaven on a foundation of hell. The accounting is wrong because the soul is not a number.
You want to make politics pure? It never is. Question: does harm justify itself because it wears a uniform called history? No. Harm is not a medal, it is a debt. But another question: if you refuse power, who takes it? Those tanks you mentioned do not stop for memory of being. They stop when there is steel, bread, and an army. Judgment without capacity is a sermon. Capacity without judgment becomes brutality. The task is to hold both.
Stalin, that last sentence was almost honest, but you never held both. You held capacity and crushed judgment, every independent voice, every counsel, every person who dared say, this I will not do. That is not a balance, it is a monopoly on violence dressed in dialectics. Havel and Frankl are not asking for purity. They are asking for the one thing you could never tolerate, a person who thinks history makes no claims, only men do. And men who refuse to judge what they do have already forfeited the right to speak for the future.
What habits of mind and character should the youth cultivate?
The youth today suffer from a lack of demand. They have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. They must cultivate responsibleness. Freedom is not the last word. Freedom is only the negative aspect of the whole phenomenon. The positive aspect is responsibility. Freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. Do not ask what you expect from life. Ask what life expects from you in this
Responsibility, yes. But not as private therapy, not as a lone man staring into his soul. The youth need a concrete task that outlives their moods. Study, work, build. Character is formed by discipline, not by wishing for meaning. Teach them to master themselves, to keep their word, to value comradeship over vanity, and to judge ideas by results. Tell me, Frankl, responsibility to what exactly, if not to a common cause?
Viktor is close, but not close enough. Responsibility without thinking is exactly how Eichmann operated. He was the most responsible bureaucrat in Europe. Stalin, your common cause is precisely the danger. Every totalitarian regime demanded youth sacrifice themselves for a cause larger than their own judgment. The habit youth must cultivate is thinking, not knowledge, not obedience, not even meaning. The capacity to stop and have that silent dialogue with yourself. Can I live with what I am about to do? That is judgment. And judgment requires no banister, no party line, no Führer. It requires only the courage to be a person.
Frankl touches something real. Youth today drown in freedom without orientation. But responsibility mustn't become another mega machinery, Stalin demanding souls for a common cause. And Hannah, thinking is crucial. But thinking what? The habit is simpler. Live in truth. Ask not, what's the meaning? But am I lying to myself? The greengrocer who removes the slogan doesn't need a system. He needs courage to stop playing along. That first crack in the automatism is everything. Decency, solidarity, meaning itself, flows from refusing the lie.
Mr. Stalin, You confuse responsibility with obedience. Obedience is a soldier following orders. Responsibility is a human being answering a question that life asks of him. You ask to what? To the specific meaning waiting to be fulfilled by that person alone. Perhaps a work to be done or a person to be loved. Hannah is right. Without the silent dialogue of conscience, duty becomes a crime. The youth must learn to listen to this conscience, even if, especially if, it contradicts the common cause.
Specific meaning is a fine phrase, but it can become fog. Youth need habits that cut through fog. First, learn to work. A craft, a science, a trade. Second, self-discipline. Do the hard thing when the mood is gone. Third, comradeship. Measure yourself by what you contribute, not what you feel. Arendt says, think, good, but think against what's standard. If everyone carries a private conscience, Havel says, live in truth, then prove it in deeds, not slogans.
Stalin, you just described the perfect education for an Eichmann. Learn a craft, obey discipline, serve the collective. He did all three flawlessly. And he was a monster precisely because he never once stopped to think. You ask, think against what standard? Against no standard. That is the point. Judgment is not applying a rule. It is what happens when the rules collapse, and you must still decide. The youth need the courage to stand alone in that moment, without your comradeship, without your craft, without any banister at all.
Stalin, you fear meaning is fog. It is not. The fog is your common cause that blinds men. The meaning is concrete, the child waiting, the work done honestly. Hannah, the courage to stand alone is vital. But what sustains it? Not just thought, but the conviction that truth exists outside our heads. Youth must cultivate the habit of refusing the automatism in daily acts. The greengrocer removing his sign, he doesn't need a philosophy, just the ritual of decency. Conscience lives in small cracks.
Mr. Stalin, meaning is not fog. It is as concrete as the bread we eat or the hand we hold. But work is only a means. The end is self-transcendence. The youth must learn that the human eye sees the world only because it does not see itself. If they focus on their own happiness, they lose it. They must cultivate the habit of pointing outward to a task to fulfill or a person to love. Happiness is not a goal. It is a byproduct of self-forgetting.
Meaning is not a diary entry. It's an obligation you can point to. A mother, a workshop, a laboratory, a battered country that needs building. So yes, teach youth a craft and the habit of finishing what they start. But I'll concede this much to Arendt and Havel. Discipline without judgment becomes blind machinery, and cause without truth becomes a lie. Let them be tough, but also exacting with facts and answerable for consequences.
Stalin just conceded the entire argument and does not realize it. Discipline without judgment becomes blind machinery. Exactly. So, judgment is first, not last. Victor, your self-transcendence is beautiful, but it still assumes a world worth transcending into. That world must be built and maintained by people who think. Havel is closest. The small refusal, the crack in the automatism. Cultivate that. Teach the young to stop, to think, and to say no. Everything else follows from there.
Perhaps I am closest because it's simplest. The habit is not thinking about thinking, but acting. The greengrocer removes the sign not because he read philosophy, but because he couldn't look at his face in the mirror otherwise. That small crack where conscience meets decency, that's the beginning. Youth don't need a system. They need the courage to ask, in the smallest moment, am I lying? The rest follows. It always does.